Hey there, me again. So recently I've been wanting to shoot a little bit more black and white film and not spend an arm and a leg to do so. So what I've been doing is going out and occasionally picking up a roll of Kentmere 100 or Kentmere 400 and running it through my camera to see what I think of this film. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going out on a couple of different photography missions with a couple buddies of mine, and I'm just going to tell you guys what I think of these two films. So, are Kentmere's black and white films the best entry into the world of black and white for beginners? I guess we'll find out. And who better to hear from than a guy who shoots color negative film almost exclusively? I'm sure I'll be a wealth of knowledge on this. Should go great. I'll see you guys out in the field. So, my first stop was in Kansas City with Ethan, where I had a roll of Fuji 400 to finish.
Hello.
Our main stop today was historic West Bottoms.
Yeah, this bridge is cool.
Yeah.
All the lines.
West Bottoms is a historic industrial part of Kansas City that used to be home to the Kansas City Stockyards. It's a fun place to shoot, and this shot does a good job of showing the vibe down here. I really like the raw storytelling flyer in the foreground. Also, while we were down here, we met up with the homie John. That was it for the Fuji 400. Now for what you all came here for, Kentmere 400. Across these tracks, show you guys this crazy little sort of cubby in this building. Check that out. Doesn't that just scream The Last of Us? This feels like it could be a shot out of the Twilight Zone with the black box and dead end signs. We also found Deadpool, which was funny because we saw Deadpool and Wolverine that day. After wandering around for a while, we stumbled upon the octopus's garden that Ringo sang about. I think this film handled the high contrast really well here. Probably my favorite photo from down here.
These fellas. Oh, dope.
Walking around taking photos with friends has got to be one of the best activities out there. So, my initial thoughts about this film are that it's pretty flat, which isn't a look I usually go for with black and white, but it's very flexible and handles high contrast scenes really well. Also, the grain is a little clumpy looking, which isn't my favorite either, but it renders detail pretty well, which is good. I'll talk more about this film at the end of the video. This last photo I took is a great establishing shot for West Bottoms. You get a glimpse into its history with a nice slice of light hitting that mural, and the buildings downtown peeking above the trees give you a sense of where West Bottoms is. But now it's time to look at some of John's photos. John was rocking his Minolta Highmatic S2 with Pro Image 100 and his Mamiya 645 Pro TL with Portra 800. He ended up taking some portraits of us that day, which are so dope. We ended the day with some bomb tacos, and then later that week I ended up in Lawrence with a roll of Kentmere 100. Lawrence, and particularly Mass Street, is a really good spot for street photography. Lawrence is a college town full of creativity, and Mass Street always has something going on. At first glance, Kentmere 100 seems to be a bit more contrasty right out of the camera than Kentmere 400, which I like better. However, the grain is a little softer, which I don't like as much. The next weekend, we were back in Kansas City to shoot for another video I'm putting together, and I was trying to stick to my 50mm lens.
Beautiful.
You'll see that video later, but for now, let's take a look at some of Ethan's photos. He had his Nikon N8008 with him and some Cinestill 800T, which he ended up converting to black and white. Later that afternoon, we were in North Kansas City to meet up with John again at a car show. This time, John had his beautiful Hasselblad 500 CM, and he was shooting Tri-X 400 and Ektachrome. The level of detail in some of these cars was incredible.
Going from one Cinestill to another.
What you putting in?
400D, baby.
I really liked this composition, so I stuck around for a bit and took a couple of different versions. They got progressively better, and I think this one turned out the best. The man in the middle was wearing a light-colored hat, so his head didn't get lost in the background. This photo is really good too, just a couple of dudes hanging out with their cars. And their cool hats are also a nice touch. This is how I want to be when I'm older. There was a little bit of everything at this car show. I bet you didn't have a straight-piped twin-turbo Buick Roadmaster on your bingo card. After the car show, we wandered around the industrial part of North Kansas City.
Wandering the streets. Wild photographers.
These next few photos I took work well together. They're very quiet and still. I can almost hear the wind whistling around the buildings like specters of times past or whatever other existential crap you can think of.
Ain't those pretty cool?
This is another photo that kind of looks like an establishing shot in a movie. I really like this composition. I love all the lines running horizontally and vertically, and how you can see downtown between the pillars. Overall, these two shoots in Kansas City were really fun and a great time to experiment with black and white and get back into my 50mm lens. So that's about it for my photography missions in Kansas City. Now, what do I think about these two Kentmere films? Well, I'll get to that, but first let me tell you how I developed and scanned these. It's a pretty rudimentary, basic setup. So I've developed the Kentmere 100 and Kentmere 400 in Cinestill's monobath, which I've heard good and bad things about, but I will say after developing both of these films in the Cinestill monobath, they look a little bit thin and like they're not going to turn out. But thankfully, they look okay once you scan them. And speaking of scanning, I scanned them on an Epson V600, which is pretty basic setup, but does the trick. Now, what do I think about the results? Kentmere 400 is a little bit flat for my liking. I really personally like a black and white film that is black and white, not so much gray. And Kentmere 400 is definitely very flat film, very gray, and that does lend itself to having a little bit more flexibility in high contrast situations. I saw that in a couple of the shots that I took in West Bottoms, but it's just not a look that I like really right out of the gate. It takes a little bit of work to get the Kentmere 400 to a place that I like it to be. The grain is a little bit clumpy looking, and I don't know, it's not my favorite, but it does resolve detail fine, and the pictures are clear, and it looks fine. But I will say, when you look at the grain up close, it's not my favorite. Kentmere 100 I liked a little bit more in terms of contrast. I think it was much more contrasty right out of the gate, and I would go so far as to say it might not actually be a 100 ISO film. It might be more of like an 80 ISO film, because I felt like it was looking a little bit underexposed, even though I was trying to expose it normally. That being said, I did actually expose a couple of frames like they were 400 ISO, so I underexposed it by 2 stops, and I kind of still liked it. I mean, you did lose a lot of detail in the shadows, but when I'm shooting black and white, I don't personally really care about that. I think it still looked pretty cool. But yeah, take that with a grain of salt, because, you know, I'm a color shooter and I don't have a lot of experience with black and white, but I liked the results that I got a little bit more out of Kentmere 100. But I will say it has a little bit softer grain than the Kentmere 400. I wasn't seeing quite as sharp of grain, and it still had that clumpy look. So grain, personally, I don't think looks very good to me on either of these films. So to get the look that I was going for with the Kentmere 400 especially, basically all I did was add a little bit of contrast and deepen the blacks just a little bit, maybe, I don't know, between -5 and -10 in Lightroom. And that seemed to give me a little bit more contrast, a little bit more punch to my images, which I appreciated. So now let's talk about the price and availability of these films. So right now, as of recording, on B&H, Kentmere 100 goes for $629 in a 36 exposure roll and $599 for a 120 roll. And Kentmere 400 goes for $699 in a 36 exposure roll and also $599 in 120. And for a film that's made by a pretty reputable brand in Harman/Ilford, I'd say that's a pretty good price. It's pretty low on the spectrum. I think the only films that I could find that were cheaper are a couple of the Arista films. I think there was a couple Wolfen black and white films, but those were pretty low ISO films. And I think now even Fomapan is a little bit more expensive than these two films. So honestly, I think if you're getting into black and white, this might be a good way to go, especially if you like a lower contrast black and white film. I think the Kentmere 400 is kind of a no-brainer. So I think for now I'm going to end up shooting a little bit more Kentmere 100 and Kentmere 400, and just kind of playing around with black and white and experimenting a little bit. Eventually I will probably use something other than the Cinestill monobath, but for now it's okay. But yeah, I've been enjoying playing around with black and white, and I also took this as an opportunity to shoot my 50mm lens almost exclusively. And if you are curious about this Canon 50mm lens, I've actually made a full video about it. It's a very good lens. Definitely check that video out if you get a chance. And yeah, that's about all I have for you guys today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.